Hi, it's Rabbi Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit Beth Avram Yosef of Toronto. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim. We took a break just for last week, and we are in the middle of the first chapter of section 2 of the Moreh Nevukhim. You can find the text that we'll be discussing today on page 249 in the Shlomo Pines English edition of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Let us get our bearings. The Rambam had provided a very robust introduction to the second section of Moreh Nevukhim. After having presented an alternate system of thought to describe the makeup of the universe, called the Kalamist version, the Rambam begins section 2 with telling us how he believes the universe must be depicted in reality using Aristotelian terminology and an Aristotelian worldview of how science and all of reality works. And he feels that using this Aristotelian system, which is a combination of both philosophy and what we would call science, he can demonstrate certain truths, not only about reality, but about God himself. And what's most important for him is to demonstrate that God exists, and that God is a unitary being, that there is not more than one deity, and that finally that God is incorporeal, that God is not associated with bodies or anything physical whatsoever. He had told us that he was going to set out to demonstrate this using Aristotelian logic and arguments and using the 26 premises which he had laid down in the introduction to section 2. I will point out, and I will ask for your indulgence, dear listener or dear viewer who is attending this course, that this particular chapter uses a system of logical demonstration, of proof demonstration, that is not something that is readily appealing to the modern thinker, but it was very much in vogue in the medieval world to demonstrate and to prove certain axiomatic truths using a series of arguments and presenting, argument number 1, argument number 2, it follows argument number 3, and so forth and so on until you come to your QED, you come to your conclusion, and that's the way it generally worked. And so the Rambam uses a similar kind of system that is very much in vogue, assuming that we've already accepted certain premises that have been laid down in Aristotelian writings. Last time that we studied, the first part of chapter 2, we went through the first 3 logical arguments that the Rambam had laid down for us. What we're going to discover is that in this particular section, this particular chapter, there are really 7 arguments that the Rambam lays down. The first 4 arguments really argue for not all, really argue in totality. They put forth 4 philosophical arguments, not only for God's existence, but for his unity and his incorporeality. There are going to be 3 additional arguments, 5, 6, and 7, which are really going to assume that we have accepted that God exists, and will argue either for his unity and his or his incorporeality. And so what I'm going to do now is, instead of us going through the actual text, I have a handout for you. The handout is readily available if you'd like to download it in the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and it is also available for download on the webyeshiva.org website in the course description for today's course, which once again is chapter 1 of section 2, part 2 of our discussion. So let me just share my screen with you, and then we'll get started. So today we're going to look at argument number 4. Arguments 1 through 3 were already presented when we discussed this 2 weeks ago in the first part of this discussion. So as I mentioned, the Rambam uses methods of argumentation that rely heavily on the 26 premises that he had laid down in the introduction to section 2. And this argument is what he calls likewise philosophic, which means he is using, really from the playbook of Aristotle, proofs that argue for God's existence, his unity, and his incorporeality. And I guess to sort of frame the title of this argument, it is the first changer must be constantly active. Let's explain what that means. The Rambam relies on the premise number 18 from their introduction. And the premise basically argued like this: anything that changes from potential to actual is changed from without. That is a changer, meaning that if something goes from potentially existing into actually existing, something outside of itself must have created that change. And the example that we gave when we learned the introduction was, let's say you have a pile of wood beams. They change from a potential structure to an actual structure when a contractor, when a framer puts them up and actually converts the two by fours into an actual frame structure. And if there is an impediment which prevents a thing from changing from potential to actual, the thing which removes the impediment is the new external changer. You can have more than one external changer. You can have an initial external changer, which is your first builder, and then for whatever reason he gets sick and he stops building. A new builder takes over the construction project, the new external changer. So, using that premise, the Rambam's argument number 4 goes like this: the changer itself requires something to activate it to be a changer, to be a source of change. So, for example, in our example, the builder who's going to convert the wooden beams into an actual structure, he requires activation himself. He requires training, he requires cash incentives to spur him to change the wooden beams into a structure. Thus, the changer too has passed from potentiality to actuality. Something occurs in his life which causes him to change from a potential builder to an actual builder. This process goes on almost ad infinitum, but there's a whole chain of events that activates the person or agent who's going to be responsible for change. You ultimately have to get back to a first mover or a first changer. The first in this series must be perpetually existent and constantly in an active state. If there was anything potential about this first changer, if this first changer was subject to potentiality of being dormant and not being active, then at some point it would cease to exist. And this is based upon the 23rd premise of the 26 Aristotelian premises, which goes like this: a thing which possesses potential to become active but is not currently active has the possibility of never becoming active, and indeed never even existing or ceasing to exist. And essentially what the Rambam's argument is, using Aristotle, is that if something can change from being potential to actual and from actual to potential, then at some point in its existence it will cease to exist. And in order for all of reality to be perpetual and eternal, there therefore must be a first changer, the first agent in a series, which is constantly in an active state and never in a potential state. Furthermore, the Rambam argues, this first changer cannot be physical, since anything that exists, since anything physical exists at some point in its existence in potentiality and not in actuality, as per the 24th premise, that anything which can exist in potentia must possess matter, and conversely, anything that possesses matter at some point exists in potentia, at some point is dormant. And if you recall, we gave that analogy of human beings or animals which are sometimes at rest, sometimes in motion. That's due to their physicality. And finally, any being that is not matter nor exists in matter must be unitary, as per the 16th premise. A thing which is not a body cannot be perceived in terms of quantity or be more than one. And so QED, the Rambam says that this fourth argument has successfully demonstrated that number one, God, this first changer, is always in an active being, is never in a state of potentiality. By definition, therefore, this being, God, this first changer, is incorporeal, must not be related to the physical. And finally, this God must be unitary. That's the nature of the structure of this fourth argument, that the first changer must be constantly active. So, after presenting the first four arguments in this first chapter, the Rambam has three more arguments which he does not call philosophic in nature. And I think the reason why is because these are arguments which I think the Rambam has perhaps come up with on his own. And furthermore, he's not using a formal structure of starting from beginning to end to prove from these arguments that A, God exists, B, God is unitary, and C, God is incorporeal. But rather, what you'll see from these last three arguments is that all, and as the Rambam will state himself, these final arguments assume the existence of God and seek to prove either his unity, which will be arguments 5 and 6, or his incorporeality, which will be argument number 7. And just to quote from the Pines translation, at this juncture, the Rambam writes, all these aforementioned four arguments that were comprise the first part of chapter 1 are demonstrative methods of proving the existence of one deity who is neither a body nor a force in a body, while believing at the same time in the eternity of the world. And this is an important point because, as the Rambam is going to demonstrate, he's working under the assumption of Aristotle's 26th premise that the world has eternally existed. When we transition in later chapters in section 2, the Rambam will depict God as the creator of heaven and earth and will depart from Aristotle's 26th premise that the world has existed eternally. But for now, at this very early stage in section 2, the Rambam is still working with Aristotle's 26th premise that the world has existed eternally, and these proofs work because of that premise and understanding. So, argument number 5, which is going to argue for God's unity, goes something like this. If there were two deities, each would have two causes. And the argument goes like this. Let's assume for a moment that there are two deities for the sake of argumentation so that we can show that this doesn't work. Each deity has two endowed qualities. And the qualities are the quality which makes them a deity over a shared world that they jointly control. In other words, the quality of each deity is that it is a god or completely in control over a system, the system that we call our existence or our world. And the second quality that each deity has is the quality of being different from the other deity. Now, as per the 19th premise from the introduction, a thing which exists because of a cause or causes is by definition a possible existent and not a necessary existent. Because if I exist because of something that is an agent that causes me to exist, then I can just as easily not exist as exist based on the activity of the agent that brought me into existence or that is responsible for my existence. Seeing as each deity has multiple causes, each deity is only a possible existent and therefore not a first cause of itself or others. And that's the argument. Seeing as how each deity, if there is more than one deity, has these multiple characteristics of number one, being in control of a world and being different and distinct from the other deity, this indicates that it has multiple this multiple characteristics. It makes it a compound being, which requires a unitary agent to cause it to come into existence. And so that's argument number 5, is that if indeed there was more than one deity, then each deity would be a compound structure, and any compound structure by definition has causes that cause it to become that compound structure, that complex structure, and therefore it cannot be the necessary deity as we know it. There must be something before it or responsible for it, which is the real deity. So that proves that the real deity must be unitary. Argument number 6 similarly argues that God is unitary based on the premise that all of creation is unitary, and therefore the deity must also be unitary. Now, this harkens back not just to the introduction of section 2, But the Rambam wrote at the very beginning of chapter 72 in section 1, and we quote it for you here in our handout. The Rambam had written, "Know that this whole of being is one entity and nothing else." The Rambam works under the assumption that Aristotle worked under, that everything that exists in our world, including from the outermost sphere until our world, which is at the lowest level in the center of this construct called the universe, everything is connected and everything is unitary. There are no vacuums. Nothing separates the spheres. Everything is touching and everything is connected and everything is unitary. I mean to say that the sphere of the outermost heaven, with everything that is within it, is undoubtedly one individual entity. The differences between its substances, I mean the substances of this sphere with everything that is within it, are like the differences between the limbs of a man, for instance. And so therefore, even though Aristotle and the Rambam both acknowledge that the elements that make up the heavenly realm are different from the elements that make up our earthly realm, nonetheless, it's like saying that there are different organs in the body. The liver has a different constitution from the heart, which has a different constitution from a bone, but they're all part of the same body, and everything is interconnected and dependent upon each other. And if that's the case, then if you were to assume that there were two deities instead of one, then there are two possibilities, that either A, one deity works during one time and the other works during the other time, or B, both deities work together since only their joint effort can affect existence. Those are the two possibilities that the Rambam says. If we were to assume that there are two deities, either each deity works independently of the other, and therefore they sort of take shifts, where one deity works, let's say, during the day and the other deity works at night, or they work in unison, and the reason why they need to work in unison is because neither deity has the ability to control the world on its own, and therefore must work in tandem with another deity. But the Rambam says that both of these arguments are absurd, and he goes through the exercise as follows. If we were to take the first possibility, that each deity works at separate times, what prevents one deity from acting during the time that the other is active? All of time is uniform, as is all of physical reality, as has been proven already. Everything is unitary, everything is interconnected. Furthermore, this would suggest that each deity is subsumed and constrained by time. And that's also a weakening of an all-powerful deity, to be conscribed in some way by time. Furthermore, during the deity's time of inaction, it would have to pass from potentiality or dormancy to actuality in order to become active again. This would require a changer its cause. And we know that a deity is not supposed to have a cause that causes it to change. Furthermore, this suggests that each deity exists in potentiality. All of the above is impossible in describing a perfect active deity. And so the first option, that each deity takes a shift, then the dormant period of that deity, when it's not active, makes it impossible for that deity to be an actual deity. Argument, the other possibility is that they work in tandem. If both deities work together, then each deity must have a cause which affects it to unite with the other deity. But that which is necessarily existent has no cause. Furthermore, that changer which causes the two deities to come together is the ultimate cause, and therefore the ultimate deity, which itself must be unitary. And so therefore, using this argument, the Rambam says, it has thus become clear, also according to this method, that the fact that all that exists is one indicates to us that he who caused it to exist is also one. Now, if the world that existed was not unitary, one perhaps could make the argument that each deity is in control of its own section of reality, that there are two separate components of reality, and therefore there are two deities, each deity being in control of its part of reality. But since all reality is interconnected, therefore the Rambam is sort of confined to this box of saying the one of two possibilities, that either the two deities work in shifts or the two deities work in tandem, neither of which is possible. And so that's argument number 6. Again, arguments 5 and 6 have argued for the unity, necessary unity of God, and that makes so that sort of bolsters the first 4 arguments. And finally, argument number 7, using the 22nd premise that God must be incorporeal, that God does not have a body. What is the 22nd premise that we saw in the introduction? Every body is composed of 2 things, matter and form. Their combination invariably results in accidents of each body, the accidents being quantity, shape, and position. This is classical Aristotelianism, and it basically posits that any body that exists in the physical universe is comprised of 2 things. We've discussed this extensively already. Matter, one of the 4 elements, and the thing that gives that element its structure, like a chair, right, which is made out of wood. The element would be the wood of the chair, and the shape of the chair would be the form. Okay? Now, if everything that exists in the physical plane is a compound structure made of more than one thing, as we just pointed out, it's at least 2 things, matter and form. He says, since every compound object requires a changer or agent to cause its matter and form to conjoin, and every physical object is compound in its structure, both the fact that a physical object requires an agent and that it is a compound structure makes it impossible that it is a necessary existent, both by the virtue of the fact that it requires a changer and by virtue of the fact that it is a compound existent. And we've explained already, anything that is not unitary is not a necessary existent being, and ergo it cannot be God. And so that's the 7th argument, that because everything in the physical plane is a composite structure, God must be incorporeal if God were to be truly God. That's a very brief argument, and it's the 7th argument arguing for God's incorporeality. Now, the Rambam is going through these exercises to tell us that in using purely Aristotelian logic, I'm able to demonstrate the fact that God exists, that God is unitary, and that God is incorporeal. And now at the very end of the chapter, he uses this final sentence, which I think is really important for us to conclude with. And he basically states as follows: after having set forth these demonstrations, I shall start to give an explanation of that method which is emphatically ours as we have promised. And this promise was something that the Rambam said he was going to do back in chapter 71 of the first section. And as the Shem Tov commentary to the Moreh Nevukhim explains, meaning I will argue for the God of creation, not just Aristotle's God of eternal existence. I've used all 26 premises in laying out the existence, the unity, and incorporeality of the Aristotelian God. I have to now depict the Jewish God using Aristotelian philosophy. That I haven't done yet. I've got to talk about the God of creation, and I am going to begin that in the ensuing chapters. So at least we know the Rambam has mapped out for us where we are going, what direction we're going in. Up until now, in section 2, we've been studying not really what we can call Torah, but rather Aristotelianism, Aristotelian philosophy. Starting with chapter 2 of section 2, we're going to start transitioning from pure Aristotelianism to a fusion of Aristotelianism and the Torah's depiction of God. Looking forward to doing that with you starting next week. And thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a good week. Take care now.